Well, it's been 20 years since that fateful day on September 11th when the airliner flew into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon, and aviation changed forever. Here on the screen are some of the people that were at AOPA at that time and probably the closest to the action. Tom Haines, Melissa Rudinger, and of course the president at the time, Phil Boyer. So let's start with you, Phil. What do you remember of that September 11 event?
Well, I remember walking in my office, which was one of the few offices at the time, I guess, that had a TV set, and everybody's gathered around looking at the screen and quick to inform me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And of course, my first thought and their first thought, oh no, now we have more ills for general aviation. You know, thinking it's a small light plane that didn't know where the corridor was up the Hudson River. And as we watched a little further, it unfolded that, well, maybe it was a small commuter plane. And then in the end, we found out it was an airliner. But that was just the start of general aviation, in many respects, being blamed for this, even though our planes weren't involved at all.
So what was your thought about the effect on general aviation? When I remember that a bunch of us came into your office and actually saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. But what was your thought about what it would do to general aviation?
Well, nothing like this had ever happened before, but it was obviously more what's happening to aviation as a whole as soon as it was determined that these were air carriers. And all aviation stopped. Whether they were going to have to land at Goose Bay or whether they were going to land at the nearest airport, the airliners just completely stopped, and all general aviation flights had to stop. I think the biggest concern was that when will both airliners and general aviation get back in the air? And lots of rumors going around, both Washington and everywhere else. Gee, you know, these little planes could be just as big a factor as the big ones. They fly around, there's no radar control, nobody knows who they are, what they are, and so we had to kind of go along with that. But typical AOPA fashion, I think it's one of the assets of the organization back then and today. We have access to prominent politicians, but in this case, the Secretary of Transportation. And by that very afternoon, I was on the phone with him and trying to understand the gravity of this. And of course, he was just kind of putting the pieces together, but arguing right at that moment that, well, don't shut us out and let the airliners fly.
Well, and one of the first things that you did was to tell Melissa to get down to the FAA, take her laptop there with her, and stay there until everything was fixed, right?
Yeah, I didn't even say it in that nice a term. It's get out of here and don't come back till you've solved this problem.
So I'm not misremembering that. No, it was pretty. I suspect your phone call probably prompted that, but I recall you literally did call me into your office and said, get down there and don't come back. And one of the reasons I was the one to do that is at that time I ran all of our policy stuff related to airspace air traffic control. So any airspace air traffic control policy or anything that goes wrong in the system, I lead our team, or at that time led our team on those efforts. So I did do that, and I will say the advantage I had is because I did a lot of work at the FAA, I had an FAA badge, and if I had not had my FAA badge that day, I doubt that I would have gotten into the building. And I doubt that I would have gotten upstairs to the 10th floor, which is where all the executives are, including the FAA administrator. And I doubt that I would have gotten into the situation room they had set up. And it turns out I was the only civilian ever in that room working to help open up the airspace. The door closed pretty quickly behind me once some of the defense folks figured out I was not an actual FAA employee. So it got a little dicey. But in the end, we all worked together.
As I recall, you were so close to where the decision-making was going on that before a NOTAM came out to pilots or to AOPA, you would call us with what's going to be in the NOTAM.
That's right. In fact, I had a part. Fortunately, was able to help build some of those NOTAMs, but more importantly, kill some of those NOTAMs. By the end of September, it was looking pretty dire. It was looking like They were going to put prohibitive airspace over pretty much every major city, at least for VFR traffic, and make it permanent. And so there were lots of things like that that we really worked hard to push back on.
Now, one of the things that AOPA did was we set up a war room in the boardroom, and Tom, you were involved in a lot of that. What are some of your memories of that?
Yeah, I mean, we immediately put our communication channels to work, mostly the websites and email newsletters too at that time, to try to start informing pilots about what was going on. Of course, our 800 line to our call center was overwhelmed with calls quickly, people wanting information. And we soon were recognized over the course of just a few days as the place to go for the latest information. We even heard and learned later that the FAA and Flight Service were directing people to call AOPA to find out what was happening from an airspace standpoint and with NOTAMs and all that sort of thing. And it was rewarding to be a part of that. But it was also frustrating at times because some of the requirements they were putting on us were ridiculous. Quickly telling us we can't fly over nuclear power plants after they had taken down all the off the charts where those power plants were and how is it we're not supposed to fly there if we don't know where they are. But we worked our way around that and I think did a good job of letting pilots know what we knew as quickly as we could.
Yeah, I think the website really came into its own because of 9/11, and there was a lot of craziness that happened during that time. Melissa, what were some of the crazy things that were happening down there in Washington that you had to sort of stop in the tracks and say, wait a minute, you guys don't know what you're doing?
Well, the nuclear TFRs were a big one because it's like, don't fly there, like Tom said, but we're not going to tell you where they are. Another big one was, like I said, the VFR restrictions. One of the ways we got around that, it was crazy, and it looked like it was going to become an emergency NOTAM to come out. I worked with my my airspace counterparts at the FAA, and they want GA to fly. They're not interested in stopping us. It was the security side that wanted to make sure there was no VFR. And so what we did is we told them that they would be on a VFR flight plan. If they're on a VFR flight plan, can they fly in the metropolitan areas? And the security folks ultimately agreed to that because they hear flight plan and they think it's like the airliners. But as you know, behind the scenes, a VFR flight plan, they're not actually tracking you with it. So it would only be able to be used if something did happen, which thankfully it didn't. But that was a way to get past that barrier of we have to know who you are and what you're doing at all times. And then eventually, as we got further away from 9/11, we eventually were able to get rid of that VFR flight plan mandate as well. But September was pretty rough, and in fact, it was 3 years that I pretty much focused most of my time on getting back to the pre-9/11 normal, which it took about 3 years. And it was the new normal, with really almost all the restrictions lifted except for the larger stadium TFRs and the larger VIP TFRs.
And Disneyland.
Yeah, we can't.
Oh yeah, Disneyland. Can't forget Disneyland.
We can't forget the Mickey Mouse TFR, which is still in place.
Yes.
But one of the interesting things, though, was that while there was all of this fear about aviation flying, one of the first things that was back in the air were some general aviation flights to carry blood supplies around the country.
Yeah,
yes, and I think we could file IFR flight plans in the third day since 9/11. And so the airlines were flying about 24 hours before us, but our aircraft could. The other thing that was very restrictive was that there could be no flights for general aviation except student pilots in the 30 Class Bravo pieces of airspace, which didn't make a lot of sense, but somebody, I guess Melissa down there, didn't want to stop flight training or something.
Exactly. And I think you have a good story about that.
Well, I know we got all kinds of stories from everybody, but the one that interested me the most was clear across the country in Washington State. There was a student pilot, been working on his certificate, and he'd been taking lessons in the Class Bravo, but he was outside of the Class Bravo and could fly, in either place. However, it came time for his check ride. Well, the designated examiner was in the class Bravo of Seattle-Tacoma. So he flew whatever, 172 or 150 into that airport in the Puget Sound area, which he could do as a student pilot. He passed his practical test, but now he was a private pilot. So he could not legally fly out to go back to his home airport. So the training facility outside of Class B garnered 2 airplanes, 2 flight instructors, flew up, and I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. And I think shortly after that, you were able to talk some sense into it.
Yeah, there's one-off situations. Just funny things happen when you do rulemaking kind of on the fly, or make rules up as you go, kind of, which is what was happening. Things were popping up, then we were beating them back down. So that's a good example of where there's unintended consequences.
So, Melissa, how long did you stay down there at FAA?
So I was down there about 6 weeks, and like I said, the first 4 or 5 weeks I was in the Situation Room. I could tell I was wearing out my welcome when they relocated me to another floor in a cubicle, and I could still go in there for meetings and things. But it was clear that we were going to get as much as we were going to get with my presence there. The work continued, but in terms of me being there, and when I say there, I mean, 20 hours a day. At one morning, my counterpart at FAA came in, and I was asleep on her couch. So I actually fell asleep overnight there at one point. But I had a hotel across the street, and it just, you didn't want to go home. I mean, there was just so much work to do, and it was very, horrible time for the nation, a horrible time for general aviation. But it felt so good to be a part of the solution. And so after 6 weeks, I think it was, I came back here to Frederick and continued the work from here.
Melissa correctly identified that it was a lot more security people than the FAA. And I think one of AOPA's real assets to get this mantra off general aviation, flying around, not knowing who they are, our airports unprotected, we have no fences at most of the airports, they're not guarded, there's no TSA officer, was we quickly rallied, and Tom, I know you were great at communicating this, a program we invented on the spot called Airport Watch. And what it was say, who's better to keep track of who's on an airport or not than the pilots who fly in and out of that airport and know everybody by first name almost. So I remember going down to the TSA administrator at the time and presenting him the idea for this program and said, all we need, we'll do all the work, Tom, his magazine and all the electronic media, but we do need an 800 number that's answered 24/7 that you folks put up, that if a member spots something on an airport, they can call this number, and then you take it from there. And he quickly got on board, and I still fly long after these signs are tarnished and damaged, and see these GA Secure, which is the 800 GA Secure number. And it did a lot for us with both Congress and certainly the security environment to show that we're here to help, not to hinder.
Yeah, that's right. We did a lot of videos to help support that effort, to educate pilots about what to look for. And I've often wondered, Phil, when's the last time anybody answered that call, that number, or anybody dialed that number for that matter? I wonder what happens if you call that number. But yeah, I did want to relay one interesting flight that actually did occur on 9/11 after of course, the horrible tragedy. There was one flight that managed to continue in the national airspace system. Was a Learjet, as I recall, took off from California, destined for Florida, with some snake venom on it, or antivenom, because a snake handler in Florida had been bitten pretty severely by a snake, and they had used all the antivenom that they had available to them, and he was going to die. And so they managed to get permission to fly from California, the snake antivenom. So there was one GA flight to the rescue on 9/11 to save this fellow in Florida.
One of the things I think also that we need to remember is that not only was Melissa down working with the FAA and the security types, but AOPA was working in Capitol Hill as well. You want to talk about that a bit, Phil?
Well, I know there were several congressional committees that wanted to hear from us. I think there was some testimony also in the House Transportation and the security areas. about just what was happening. But I think most of the politicians, once you began to explain general aviation and that a Cessna 150 or 172 or even a Beech Bonanza can in nowhere be anywhere near the kind of tragedy that occurred with the large transport category aircraft.
But still, post 9/11, some things have changed with general aviation. Let's chat about that a bit.
Yeah, so I think the biggest change, we talked about some of the permanent large restrictions around stadiums as well as the presidential TFRs. I think security, there have been in the background, there's some security things happening to vet lists, pilots, make sure that we don't have any bad actors in the system. So there's a lot of passive stuff that's changed. And of course, having the Transportation Security Administration, that's as a result of 9/11. But what we haven't seen, and I'm glad, is we haven't seen TSA-style security come to GA airports, because there was a lot of push on that. Once we got all the airspace straightened out and we got to the new normal, then the security folks started looking at the ground. And so the battle then moved more towards airports. And so fortunately, we don't have those kinds of restrictions today. But as Phil said, we had to become the eyes and ears and make sure that the security folks understood we're the best watchdogs at any general aviation airport.
One of the areas I think that was quite different, and I did several flights in the 90s before this tragedy, where I could fly to Washington National Airport with out-of-towners. I know several of our international AOPA people fly right into the airport, just take the train across the river, and you'd be right in the center of Washington, D.C. And the one piece of airspace that has still continued to be very closely monitored, and probably rightly so, is the Washington, D.C. area. And you in Frederick, Maryland know very well how secure that is and how difficult it really is to get into the airports in that area. And certainly we're not going to be flying into Dulles or Washington National.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's so close to us. I sometimes forget that's one of the most lasting impacts is local for AOPA, and that is the DC Special Flight Rules area and the no-fly zone. It's huge, and it impacted a number of airports. And I can tell you, we took that one to the mat to try and get it reduced or eliminated, and ultimately it's not going away. However, you can get access to most of that airspace now, not Washington National, if you go through their program and get the waiver and learn how to file and fly in that airspace. So we do have access. It's just you got to jump through a few hoops.
Tom, what were some of the communications challenges, and what were you hearing from the members during that time?
Well, it was just so much bad information being distributed out there, and so part of one of our biggest challenges was to try to come up with the most accurate information that we could and get it out there as broadly as we could. But certainly there were people, worried VFR pilots, like, am I ever going to be able to fly again? Am I ever going to be, my airplane is trapped inside a Class B or under a Class B shelf. Am I ever going to be able to even get it out? In the first few days, there was those kinds of concerns. And of course, we didn't have all the answers, but we could at least assure people that we had people, and folks like Melissa, downtown working those kinds of issues. A lot of questions about airspace. When am I going to be able to fly here, there, or wherever? One of the most surprising things for me is that we got the Hudson River corridor opened up in New York again. I had been kayaking with a friend of mine on Sunday, 2 days before 9/11, and he wasn't a pilot, and I said, but he's an enthusiast, and I said, we need to go fly the Hudson corridor. You'll have a great time. It's a really wonderful experience. 2 days later, of course, 9/11 happens, and I had to say to him, look, I don't think we're ever going to get to do that again. Well, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we actually went and did it and flew the Hudson corridor, and it is a magnificent experience, and I think demonstrates all the hard work that AOPA did in convincing the authorities that GA airplanes can fly safely in complex airspace close to metropolitan areas like that.
Yeah, not to toot our own horn, but what do you all think would have happened if AOPA hadn't been there?
I think we'd look a lot more like Europe, or a lot of European countries, where it's pretty restricted, obviously on a flight plan, probably an IFR flight plan. But I really, not to toot our own, and it's not just us, there's other aviation associations, but nobody was literally there in the room the way we were. And it took a whole team here to do it, and nobody has the political clout in general aviation that we do. And so I will toot our own horn a little bit. I think we made a difference.
Yeah, I think Melissa's absolutely right, and there's no organization I can think of worldwide, having been a part of an international AOPA, that has fought for general aviation as hard as we did in this regard. And it's still, since that time, you think about it, we have basic med because of AOPA. Well, we have LSAs, light sport aircraft. We still have a burgeoning used aircraft market. All of this could have been completely dampened or put out had it not been for the work we did in those weeks before 9/11, after 9/11. I did learn from this little discussion we're having as a group, because we don't get together that often. I didn't know that Melissa was in a hotel there. So I was afraid she might come back, disheveled with the original clothes that she wore down there, her hair all messed up and everything else.
Yeah,
now I did learn that.
Yeah, you sprang for a hotel, so thanks.
So Phil, was this the biggest challenge of your career at AOPA?
I would say so. Probably was, because I think, though, there was light at the end of the tunnel almost immediately after those first discussions with the Secretary of Transportation, even the day of. It was not a matter of if we ever get most of this back, it was when. And the when took a little bit longer for some things. We had to be patient, but otherwise it was a giant challenge, but also in terms of advocacy and proving a value of an organization like AOPA over these many years, it was a good demonstration.
Yeah, I think that one thing to keep in mind is that there are some lingering effects from a flight training standpoint, where any flight school that's training, from a foreign person has to fill out some paperwork. CFIs have to do that too, and some paperwork tracking, that sort of thing. So there are some things like that. But another point is regarding the TFRs. There were lots and lots of them that cropped up right after 9/11, and Phil pointed out and got us hooked up with Jeppesen. And we actually created a new version of our flight planner, our online flight planner, that included a graphical user interface that depicted temporary flight restrictions, TFRs. And so that was our way of helping pilots really understand the airspace better and where the restricted airspace was, so that we could all fly safely around it. And at the time, it seems, now we have ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot and all these other moving maps that are, readily available. But at the time, that was pretty innovative, that we had TFR showing on an electronic display for us like that. It was pretty helpful.
Well, I think it was also at that time that we started sending out the selected emails to people who were in a TFR area to let them know there was a TFR.
That's right.
Yeah, and we still do that today.
Yeah.
Still do that today. Another benefit of your AOPA membership.
Right.
Amen. Thank goodness.
So Phil, what are you doing in retirement?
Well, I'm flying a fair amount. I spent a little time, as Tom knows, building an airplane, which is something I never thought I'd do, since I never knew a rivet from a screw about 7 years ago. And actually, I'm taking it up this afternoon as soon as it cools off just a bit to exercise the engine. And we have to get around the country, I have a beach bonanza like Tom's. He's the one who found it and for me, and selected the right one with the right equipment on it. So I'm still enjoying the fruits of all the AOPA initiatives, the past ones when I was there, and the ones that still continue to occur with this great organization.
All right. Well, it was kind of fun getting the band back together. Someday post-COVID, we can do it in person.